Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this inaugural Mary Bosanquet lecture at last. And for anyone who was hoping to be here this time last year, I can only apologize on behalf of Methodist women. And we were all, including Paula, so very disappointed that we had to cancel at the last minute. So it's an absolute delight that Paula was able to fit in with this week, and we're all able to be here. I am Hilary Evans. I'm an ex-Methodist Women in Britain president, possibly the last Methodist Women in Britain president, because we have now changed to having co-chairs. And if any of you want to know about the organisation, then come and talk to one of us. Ruth and Maggie are both here. So if you're interested to know, then please do come and talk to one of us. People have been asking, why are we instigating a Mary Bosanquet lecture? Partly, it's because we would like them to understand that there is depth in what Methodist women in Britain try to do, and that we have a wide range of activities that we get involved in. So that's part of it. Many of you will know that we largely focus particularly on women and the needs of women. And so when we were thinking of somebody who would be an appropriate title for these lectures, we sought someone who was a representative of women in Methodism, both in the past, but also inspiring us in today. And so we came up with Mary Bosanquet. And many of you will know that Mary Bosanquet, or Mary Bosanquet Fletcher, as she became, was one of, well, I shouldn't really say it, but one of Wesley's women. And I have to be careful about the connotation, I know. But she was an Essex girl. She was born in Leytonstone in September 1739. And she was born into a fairly wealthy Anglican family. Her father was Lord of the Manor, and he was a merchant in London. When she was born, her tongue was fused inside her mouth, and she was lucky to survive the separation of that. Her father was a very strong Anglican, and through his influence, he saw her confirmed at St. Paul's Cathedral. But she heard about Methodism initially from a servant girl in her house, and later her elder sister introduced her to someone at the Foundry Society, and her interest in Methodism really grew from there. However, her parents became very concerned that she would influence her younger brothers into Methodism, and so they asked her to leave the family home and go and live elsewhere. So she then set up house with Sarah Ryan, who was some years older, but they became very close. And then in 1757, she met Sarah Crosby, who was a Methodist class leader at the time. And very soon after that, she dedicated her life to the church and to charity. She then rejected her wealth for some time, but she soon realized that she could use it to help other people. And from there, she and Sarah Ryan set up an orphanage school modeled on John Wesley's Kingswood. Mainly, they supported poor girls from London. But the establishment grew and attracted other Methodist women, and including Sarah Crosby, who worked with them. And they also supported a lot of women from the poorer areas, particularly when they were unwell, and many of them then stayed on to help with the orphanage and the school. Within the orphanage, discipline was very strict, but the girls were taught skills that would be beneficial to them as they became adults. Mary was the owner and the primary organizer, planning and leading worship regularly. Scripture readings and prayers were part of every day's routine. And Mary and Sarah Crosby requested John Wesley to send them a preacher because, of course, women were not supposed to be preaching at that time. John Wesley sent someone to work with them, and this was a very successful move. And very soon, there was a Methodist society set up in Leytonstone, and the whole society began to grow. So then a bit later, Mary and Sarah continued to arrange services on Thursday evenings, and subsequently they wrote to John Wesley asking him to allow women to preach and defending the fact that they were organizing worship themselves. And so this was seen as the first defense of allowing women to preach. And Mary argued that women should be allowed to answer God's call. And so from 1771, John Wesley then allowed women to preach, mainly because the women were very successful at drawing other people into the societies. So it was actually good for his movement. And then after 5 years in the Leytonstone area, they decided that they would move the orphanage to Yorkshire, partly for financial reasons, but also with the idea that they would provide food by growing it themselves. But this was not very easy because their experience in farming, etc., was pretty limited. So it wasn't the most successful idea that they ever had. And not very long after they moved to Yorkshire, Sarah Ryan died. But Mary continued and managed to face considerable criticism and opposition from people in the area because of the strictness of the way that she dealt with the children. And then she had met John Fletcher through the Foundry in London, and they eventually married, but not before she had made sure that all the children in the orphanage had somewhere to go or some work to go on to. And then following their marriage, the Fletchers moved to Madeley in Shropshire, just south of Telford. So if we'd been able to have the lecture last year, it would have been a really appropriate setting, but there we go. And Mary then, they set up a church, they built a manse, and started to do all the work and the worship and the pastoral care within that area. But after about 3 years, then John died. But Mary continued with the work, was allowed to stay in the manse, and so she was preaching and teaching and holding meetings, continuing to tend to the sick. And at 75, she was still preaching 5 times a week. How many of the local preachers here would like to do that, I wonder? She died in 1815, and her legacy lasted a lot longer in Madeley. So Mary, a strong, faith-driven woman, one of Mr. Wesley's first women preachers, and she had a significant influence on everyone around her. And this short prayer is attributed to her. Day by day, O God, we praise you, feel you near and prove your faithfulness. Daily, we long to love according to your word, daily to know you as all in all. Amen. So this evening, we welcome Paula. And Paula, I'm pleased to be able to welcome you this evening. It's an absolute delight to have you here. Paula, as many of you will know, has quite a history herself. She was, well, you didn't, well, you know. She hails from Manchester originally, I believe, and she trained at Oxford colleges, went on to do a PhD, and then has worked at Ripon College, teaching theology. A bit later, she was at Queen's, and I know there are one or two people here who have heard her lecturing to them as they were training. And then she took a spell becoming independent and, what's the phrase? Yes, freelancing. And then has had spells working in various theological places and different ways. Became freelance again for a while, and then was invited to become Canon Chancellor at St Paul's Cathedral, where she now is based. So, as I say, not many of us can put a CV together quite like that, can we? So, absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you here, Paula. Before I actually just hand over to Paula, can I just say that we have Matt at the back who is recording. If anyone is not happy with potentially being on that recording, then please either let Matt know or move right to the back so that you won't be included at all. And also Paula has a few copies of her book, Lydia, at reduced price, which her husband Peter in the front row here has got hold of at the moment, so be first come, first served for that. But the bookstall, the conference bookstall, will have some other books of Paula's available tomorrow for anybody who wants to purchase. So, great pleasure, Paula, to hand over to you, and we really look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, and it's really lovely to be here. I was so gutted last year when it became clear that I wasn't going to be able to come. It was one of those where I kept on going, no, it'll work, it'll be fine, and then it wasn't. And sadly we had to pull the plug. So delighted to be here, and just an indication of how keen I am to be here. This is my week off, so I'm come in my week off to talk to you. And just a little commercial note at the start about the books. I've got 10 copies of my book Lydia in hardback, which it's normally £16.99, but I can let you have for £10 if anyone's interested. My husband will do the deal with you later if you would like one. So let's begin by thinking about women in the Bible. Often when I meet people for the first time, they will ask me what I'm interested in. And I will say that I'm a New Testament scholar. And then they will say, any particular bit of the New Testament that you're interested in? And I say, yes, because I always dread this bit of the conversation. And I eventually will admit that I'm a Pauline scholar. And a kind of look of mixed sadness and sympathy normally comes over people's faces when I tell them that. And invariably they will say something like, you do know Paul's not very positive about women, don't you? And I always kind of tip my head on one side and go, no, not really. But one of the things I think is quite interesting to reflect on is that we have a very fixed view of women in the Bible. People will tell me regularly that there are not many stories about women in the Bible. They will tell me that women cannot have very much influence when they are portrayed in the Bible. And then they will tell me, of course, that women are not significant in the Pauline communities. And one of the things that has built in me over the years, so I've been doing this for about 30 years now, is the desire to say, do you know what? I really don't agree with you. I don't agree with you that there are not very many women in the Bible. I don't agree with you that their influence isn't great. And I absolutely don't agree with you that women were not important in the Pauline communities. And as time has gone on, I've become more and more determined to start talking about why I think that view is wrong. We can't go through all of the details today, but what I want to do is to begin to get you to understand why I want to argue that, and to begin to do some work for yourselves on understanding that a little bit more. I just got back from the most fabulous pilgrimage that I've ever been on. I was invited to lead a pilgrimage through the Holy Land on women in the Bible. It was fabulous. It was brilliant. I could wax lyrical about it for the next hour. I won't. But one of the things that I found really moving about the pilgrimage is that what we did is we, of course, chose sites that were particularly associated with women. And then at the end of the pilgrimage, we counted how many women we'd spoken about in the course of 10 days. And the number was 42. And there is something really moving about simply going around the Holy Land and saying, let's remember this woman who lived here. Let's remember that woman who lived there. The women who were here doing this. And once you start doing that, you begin to realize that that assumption that there are not many women in the Bible really is wrong. But let's begin to have a think about where it comes from and why we say it so often. So let's have a think about women in the Bible and what happens. So let's begin. I'll just stand here and press the space bar the old-fashioned way. Inevitably, it is worth noting that there are fewer women in the Bible than there are men. I mean, I'm not going to try and argue the impossible. I'm not going to try and persuade you that there are more women mentioned in the Bible than there are men, and women who are heroes of the story. Not going there. But nevertheless, I think one of the things that's worth noticing is that when we think about the Bible stories, we inevitably edit the women out who are there. And if you just take one thing away from tonight, one of the things that I want you to take away is that either, well, always subconsciously, but one of the things that happens is that what we end up doing is just not noticing the women that we could notice. So if you just take one thing away, is whenever you're reading a Bible story, read the bit before and the bit after, and make sure you haven't not noticed a woman who was already there before or after. And then ask yourself the question, am I assuming a woman isn't here who might be here? And when you start doing that, you begin to realize that there is this silent crowd of women who are behind the text that we often don't notice. And one of the reasons that we don't notice them is because art history and other forms of tradition encourage us to edit them out. And I just want to show you 3 examples of the way in which I think this happens. Here is a 14th century painting from Italy of Jesus talking to his disciples. And you will notice here is Jesus, and here are a little group of entirely men that Jesus is talking to. The assumption in this picture, as in very many pictures throughout art history, is that when Jesus addresses his disciples, he's talking to a group of men. And I will talk to you in a moment about why I think that is incorrect. There is also this immensely famous picture that you will all know, Da Vinci with the Last Supper, which is an incongruous picture in all sorts of ways. One of them being that they all thought it was a good idea to sit down the same side of the table while they ate. The other one being that in the 1st century, you would not have been sitting up at the table, you would have been lying down. And then, of course, the key one is, and this is the thing that has influenced people's imaginations possibly more than any other, is that the people at the Last Supper were Jesus and the 12 disciples, and no one else. I don't know if you know about this, but I'll show you later that we know that that's not true. We know for a fact that that's not true. So what you have in your memories, even if you don't do Da Vinci when you think about the Last Supper, even if you have a different picture in your minds, the chances of you thinking of it being Jesus and the 12 disciples are really high. So hold that one in your mind, and we'll come and think about that later. And then there's this one. I could go on for a long time, but we'll just do the 3 tonight. This is one of my favourite paintings. I absolutely love this painting. This is Caravaggio, The Road to Emmaus. And the reason why I love it is I just love the dynamism of it. It's the moment in the story when suddenly they realise it's Jesus. And you can feel them going, which is just brilliant. I love the way he captures that and the movement. And he's just kind of, the man here is just getting out of his chair. But there's a problem with it, which is there are 4 men in it. And there should, in my view, be at least one woman, if not more than one woman, depicted in this painting. And the reason why I think that, I will tell you later. But just to give you a sense that what we do in our mind's eye whenever we think about Jesus is we think about Jesus and just men. And it became really clear to me a few years ago when I was doing some Ignatian exercises. You know, when you, Ignatian exercises are when you imagine yourself into the biblical character, in biblical stories. And the person who was leading the exercise said, see who you kind of feel an affinity for in the story. And I felt myself saying, no one. I don't feel any affinity for this bunch of men who are sitting here in my imagination. And then I went, yeah, but why are there a bunch of men sitting in my imagination? It's my imagination. Why can't I insert a few women into my imagination? And it completely distracted me from what I was meant to be doing. But it made me realize that whenever I pull up a mental picture, or did pull up a mental picture of Jesus talking to the disciples, of Paul in the early church, of any of the really key moments in New Testament history, in my imagination, I had inserted solely men. And then I said to myself, well, why are you doing that? And I said to myself, I've no idea. You know, I had a little conversation going on for a while. Until I realized that actually the answer is that I could insert a whole load of women. And then I said to myself, yeah, but surely then what you're doing is the very worst crime that a New Testament scholar can do. The worst crime of there's probably quite a lot of worse crimes of New Testament scholars, but one of them is eisegesis. I don't know if you know about eisegesis. Exegesis is the idea that you unpack the text and see what's in it. Eisegesis is the idea that you interpret stuff into the text. What if I commit the crime of eisegesis by looking at women in the text? And that set me off on a path. What if I'm not doing eisegesis? What if I'm actually doing very careful exegesis and recognizing the women who are genuinely there? And my path has unfolded, as some of you will know, over the course of the past 5 years, in which that I have begun to have a look at what we can know about the women who are there in the text. Not the ones we're reading in, but what can we know about the ones who exist. So I started with the book Phoebe, in which I reflected, I'll talk about her a bit later, on the person who brought the letter from Corinth to Rome and what that tells us about who she was. And then I began work on my next book, Lydia, thinking about the woman who sold purple, mentioned in Acts and living in Philippi. And then I wrote 9 short stories of women in Holy Week who were there at the time of Jesus. And began to realize that actually seeing women in our mind's eye, seeing women in our imaginative exercises is not eisegesis. It is thorough exegesis. But you have to watch and you have to be careful about what you're looking for. So what I'm talking to you tonight about is, in a way, some of the things that I've discovered and some of the things that I hope that you will see along with me as we go. So the simplest thing that we can do when we're thinking about women in the Bible is to notice the women who are there and to imagine them back into the story. And what we need to do in order to do that is to pay very close attention to what the text says and how it mentions them. So let me give you a few examples of women in the text and how we edit them out and why it's very important to edit them back in our imaginations. The first thing I want to notice, and this is, you'll all be pleased because this is a crime for Anglicans, so you can sit down and be very snooty. But there was the lectionary. I don't actually know if the Methodist lectionary was the same at this time, but during the time of the Alternative Service Book, the ASB, there was a feast, well, still is a feast, the Feast of the Presentation of Christ at the Temple, Candlemas, one of my favourite ones. And what happened in the ASB lectionary was when they read the story for Candlemas, they had Mary and Joseph come to the temple, and they had them meeting Simeon, then they had a little gap, and then they had the ending bit. And you were going, there's somebody in the middle of the gap who was Anna. So for years and years, the Candlemas reading, the reading for Christ in the temple, completely missed Anna out. And it's one of those really striking things, is that one of the things that our lectionaries do, and they don't do it quite so obviously now, but do pay close attention, whenever you're given a reading to read in church, to preach in church, or even to read for yourself, just check they haven't started a bit late or finished a bit early and thereby missed out some women, because sometimes that is in fact the case. The other thing we've done, intriguingly, I wasn't going to say this, but I will now anyway, is that actually what Christian history has done is taken the attributes of Anna and put them on Simeon, which I think is a really, really interesting thing. So the most famous thing that you will all know about Simeon is that Simeon is an old man. How do you know that? There is nothing in the text to tell you that Simeon was old, other than the Nunc Dimittis, the now Lord, lettest thou your servant depart in peace. The assumption is that he's departing life in peace, and therefore he's very old and has been waiting for a long time. The text tells you nothing about Simeon's age. The text simply says that Anna was old. She was either really quite old or very, very old, because Anna was, according to the Greek, a widow of 84 years after her marriage. So the question is whether she was 84 or whether she was 107. So she was very, very old. We know Anna was old. We have no knowledge of Simeon's age. The other thing is that you will often see Simeon referred to as a prophet. Simeon is not called a prophet in Luke. Anna is called a prophet in Luke. Simeon was driven into the temple by the Spirit. He was a Johnny-come-lately. Anna was there in the temple 84 years, fasting and praying. Simeon came in at the last moment, gets all the credit. But I say that, as you will notice, slightly facetiously, and I don't really mean it. But it's worth just noting that actually what we do is we take characteristics of women and then apply them to handy men who are around. Again, we need to be careful about how we do that. The next is that there are women who are mentioned in passing, who are often then edited back out of the text again later. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do is notice the women who are mentioned and keep them in your mind's eye in the story, even if they're not then subsequently mentioned. I'm going to come back to these again in a moment. But the women who supported Jesus are really crucial in understanding who Jesus was and how his ministry unfolded. They're mentioned in Luke 8, they're also mentioned at the crucifixion narrative in Mark, but we magically assume that they were there and they were just happened by for half an afternoon and then they went away again. But the text suggests that the women were there for a long time, that they were following Jesus and supporting him. So one of the things that I think is quite important to do when you have your mental imagination is when Jesus is talking to the disciples, imagine the ones that we know were there back into that whole conversation. It begins to populate your imaginations much better. And then I want to talk to you about the Last Supper. So I mentioned it earlier. We often assume, as I've said already, that the only people there at the Last Supper are Jesus and his 12 disciples. But we know that that's not true. And the reason we know it's not true is in Mark's Gospel, Jesus says to 2 disciples, go ahead and prepare the room for us, go and get the supper ready. And then it says, Jesus and the 12 arrived. Now, my maths is not good, but Jesus plus 12 plus 2 makes more than 13. So therefore, we know for a fact from Mark's Gospel that there were more than just 13 people present when Jesus had the Last Supper with his friends. And therefore, we need to insert an additional 2 people into our mind map, but we might want to insert more than 2. Because when we come on to having a look at the women who were there at the crucifixion, one of the things that is very clear from the Gospels is that there were a whole crowd of women who followed Jesus from Galilee, including his mother. Now, while we do not know for certain that Jesus invited his mother to the Last Supper with his friends, just stop and think about it for a moment. There were a lot of women who were very well known to Jesus. They supported his ministry. His mother also followed him. They all came down to Jerusalem for the Passover, where they celebrated the great Passover meal, which was crucially important to Jesus and the rest of the Jews in this period. Can you conceive of a scenario in which Jesus says to his mother, sort yourself out while I go with my 12 disciples and have a private meal by ourselves? I know we don't imagine it into the story very much, but it seems to me absolutely inconceivable that Jesus would not share his last Passover meal with his mother, who we know was in Jerusalem at the time. So consequently, if you then include, and we'll have a look at them in a moment, all the Marys who were clearly there, as well as some other people, then immediately your mental image of the Last Supper has to change. And when you say that, then people will also say, and will there be children there? Well, obviously there will be children there, because if there is a large group of people with women who have followed Jesus from Galilee, you brought your whole family to the festival in the temple, so yes, children too. And again, what you then do is your mental image shifts and it changes. And you have to banish Da Vinci to a dark corner. Guess what I'm thinking of? But you have to banish Da Vinci because it simply doesn't work according to exegesis of the text, let alone anything else. So you have to again to recognize that actually our imaginations are letting us down. They're not giving us everything that we need. And then the final thing to say in this area, and then we'll move on to the next thing, is that the other thing that happens with our mental imaginations of women in the Bible is that we are regularly told of things that we know. Surely, people say to me, women couldn't, ... in the first century. We know that women were not able to fill in the blank. Well, no, they could fill in the blank, but you know what I mean? There was a whole load of things that women were not allowed to do in the first century, and people will just say to me, yes, but women couldn't be leaders of synagogues. Women couldn't inherit money. Women couldn't own businesses. Women couldn't, you name it, they couldn't do it. At which point, I then want to say, not all women. And that, I think, is one of the really important things to recognise, is that what we like to do is have something that we are absolute about, that we are utterly confident is the case, and then we say it is true across the board. So we know women could not have led Pauline communities because we know whatever it is that we know, and therefore you couldn't possibly do that. Now the thing is that as in the 21st century, so in the 1st century, women's experience was not the same. There was a vast amount of differentiation between experience in the 1st century and experience in the, around people who lived in that period. So there are things that are different, and let's just have a think of the different things that would have affected people's experience. There were issues of comparative power and wealth, and this is a really significant point. There were freedoms that wealthier women could have because they were wealthy. So they would have resources, they would have things that they were able to do that poorer women couldn't do because they didn't have the resources to do that. Conversely, there were things that wealthier women couldn't do because they were wealthy and influential that poorer women could do because they weren't wealthy and influential. So if you are thinking about whether women could do things outside of the home, we know that wealthier women would not really have done very much outside of the home, by and large, but poorer women had to, because in order that they needed to be able to earn money to look after their families. So poorer women would have had a lot more freedom to wander publicly than wealthier women would. And then one of the things you have to add on top of that is it depends where you are in the world. So people say to me, yes, but women in the 1st century wouldn't have been able to run a business, would they? Well, yes, they could, if they lived in some part of the Roman Empire, but not in other parts of the Roman Empire. So if you were the wealthy wife of an influential Roman, then you couldn't actually have your own influence and power. But think, if you know anything about the Roman Empire, you will know that there were profoundly influential women who ran things from behind the scenes. Think of some of the emperor's wives who were immensely influential in the Roman Empire. They couldn't run for Senate, they couldn't have political office, they couldn't own businesses if they were Roman rather than from somewhere else, but they could have immense influence and power. In Egypt, women could rule in their own right. And if you think about it, you know that already because of, there we go. Whereas you couldn't have had a Roman emperor who was a woman. That simply could not have happened. But in Egypt, she could. And that was absolutely clear and straightforward and not problematic at all. In Rome, women couldn't own businesses, but in Asia Minor, they could. And we know that from the New Testament, from Lydia in Acts, but we know it from elsewhere as well. In some cultures, they could not inherit, but in other cultures, they could. So there were, so for example, in Asia Minor, you could inherit your father's wealth if you were a woman, but in Rome, you could not. One of the things that people often say is that the culture that was most patriarchal, in which women's liberties were most constrained, was Palestine. Israel-Palestine in that period, the Holy Land, was one where women's kind of lives were most constrained. And you put that on one side, and then you say, yes, but Luke 8. So people will say, well, women's lives were constrained, they couldn't inherit money, they couldn't own businesses, they couldn't rule. So those women who supported Jesus from their own resources, where did they get them from, if this is true? The answer will be a complicated one, and we don't know the answer to it. But actually, if there were women who had resources, who were able to support Jesus and his ministry, then possibly your mental image, even of the most of the patriarchal cultures, is not quite correct, because they had the freedom to follow Jesus, they had the freedom to use their own resources to support him in his ministry, so perhaps your mental image is still not quite right. And what I'm trying to do in showing you all of those things is that when somebody says to you, but women couldn't, your question needs to be, How wealthy were they? How poor were they? Where did they live in the world? What culture was the one that governed their lives? And even if that were the case, here we have some evidence of them doing it in a different direction. Therefore, we need to have a think about that. So one of the things I think it's really important to do is, as soon as somebody, or even somebody being the person in your head, says to you, women can't do this in the first century, say, are we sure about that? One of my favourite pieces of evidence that was published in the 1980s was people were absolutely confident that women would not be able to lead a synagogue in the first century. Absolutely clear. There was no doubt about the fact that women couldn't do that. And then someone called Bernadette Bruton did a whole load of archaeology around early synagogues. It wasn't quite the first century. There were a couple of first century ones, but mostly they went on into the 4th century AD. And she found a whole load of headstones that talked about female leaders of synagogues. So therefore, the thing that absolutely everybody knew to be true, that women couldn't lead synagogues, was undermined by bits of archaeology that demonstrated that women had. So women couldn't until they did, and then it was all right. But one of the things I think it's just worth bearing in mind is that actually the things you know to be true may not be. And when people tell you things with absolute confidence, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. It doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. So, one of the things I think when we're thinking about women in the text is we shouldn't assume that women couldn't lead a church or own a business until it becomes clear that they couldn't lead a church or own a business. And one of the things I want to do now is to show you various pieces of evidence from the text itself of things that we know about women, both at the time of Jesus and at the time of Paul. And we'll come on to Paul in a moment. Let's just have a think about female disciples of Jesus. And the first thing that we need to do when we're thinking about disciples is be really, really careful about that word disciple, because as we've already seen from the artwork, what we do is that we elide 3 different things, at least 3 different things. The first is that there is a technical description of the 12 that is used in all of the Gospels. And so, for example, in Mark's account, when Jesus comes to the Last Supper, it says Jesus and the 12. And because elsewhere in the Gospels we know who the 12 are, well, we kind of do, but we have different lists and different Gospels, but nevertheless, we know who the 12 are. We know that they are all men. And that is relatively straightforward. But then there are the apostles. And we know that the apostles are not the same as the 12, because we know of at least one. Trivia quiz of the evening. Who's the one we know about? Who's not one of the 12? Well, we'll come on to her in a moment. Yes, Matthias, who was brought in later. But there's another as well, who is Paul. So Paul uses his title of apostle on a regular basis, despite not being the 12. So therefore, the 12 and apostles are not the same in the Gospels. And then we have disciples. And we know the disciples are not the same as the apostles, or not the same as the 12, because apart from anything else in Luke 24, it talks about 2 disciples going to Emmaus, one of whom is called Cleopas, of whom we've never heard before. Well, we might have done, but probably we've never heard of him before in Luke 24. So therefore, he isn't one of the 12, he isn't one of the apostles, he is a disciple. And consequently, we need to recognize that what we must never do under any circumstances is hear disciples and think 12. Because actually, if they want us to think of the 12, they will tell us to think of the 12. If they want us to think of more than 12, they will say disciples. So that's one of the kind of, I think, really quite crucial things to keep in your mind. And then, now let's have a look at the women present at the crucifixion, because this is just really interesting. And anyone who wants to try and work out who the women were who were at the crucifixion will just call lots of them, is the simple thing. So Matthew, we have many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And then we have Luke. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance. This is just an interesting little note. I'm again often told that the gospel that likes women the most is Luke. The others are less so. But interestingly, Luke is the one who downgrades the women's role at the crucifixion. He's pretty much the only one who says there were loads of people there, including a few women. Mark and Matthew are very clear that it was just the women who stayed. And then, of course, we've got John standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother, Mary, and his mother's sister, who we hear of for the first time here in John. Mary, the wife of Clopas, and it is normally assumed that Mary, the wife of Clopas, is not Mary's sister, for the simple reason that the parents really would have had to have lost the plot to go Mary's younger sister. Now, what shall we call Mary's younger sister? Oh, I know, Mary. It would be a very bad idea. And Mary Magdalene. But what that draws our attention to is, as I've said already, this reference to the women who provided for Jesus. And notice it's here in Mark 15. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And you might be interested to notice we've got another couple of women mentioned here in Mark. We've got Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph. It's quite probable that she's the same one mentioned in Matthew, who was also the mother of Joseph, and it's just slightly represented differently in the text. And here we have Salome mentioned for the first time. So we have a group of women who were there. And I just want to add in here, this is the Luke 8 passage that I've talked about already, where we have other women mentioned. So we've got Mary Magdalene, we've got Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and who provided for them out of their resources. And these, I think, are really interesting examples, because you've got, it's almost as though there are so many women that everyone goes, oh, don't forget Salome. Oh, no, don't forget Mary, wife of Clopas. Don't forget. And on it goes, as though there are so many women who are there following Jesus that actually they can't all remember all of their names. And I think there's something actually really quite interesting about that. And then, also, when we're thinking about women who are disciples, I would be the first person to acknowledge that there are no women in the gospel accounts who are called a disciple directly, labelled disciple. But I think one of the things that we can do is to notice that there are those who take on the form of disciple or apostle. So there is Mary, who is the sister of Martha, who is invited to sit at Jesus' feet, as you know, in Luke 10. And the whole action of sitting at somebody's feet is taking the role of a disciple to a rabbi. So she may not be termed a disciple, but she enacts a disciple. And I would say that that kind of pushes you in the direction of calling Mary a disciple. I've mentioned already the disciples sent to prepare the Last Supper. Mary Magdalene, that Barbara referred to earlier, who has throughout Christian history been recognized to be an apostle. And Thomas Aquinas was the person who called Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles. Thomas is not known for his wildly feminist views. So therefore, to include Mary under the term of apostle becomes really quite significant. And then, I've been holding back on this, but let me go for it now. The unnamed disciple with Cleopas on the road to Emmaus. One of the things that I cannot be persuaded that I'm not right on this. You can have a go if you like, but I struggled to get my head around thinking that this doesn't work. So we have two disciples on the road to Emmaus. One of them is called Cleopas, and the other one is not named. They are both going from Jerusalem to the same house, 7 miles away. If you have a look at the Greek text, the language that's used, our English translations smooth it all out rather elegantly. So it says that they're having a conversation and then they're discussing. The Greek text says that they begin with a conversation, and then it says that they were arguing with each other. The Greek word is sudzeteo, which, you know, when the Pharisees have a go at Jesus, that's the word that's used of the disciples. And then when Jesus comes alongside them, he says to the two, "What are these words that you are throwing against each other?" That does not suggest to me a polite discussion. That suggests to me a bit of an argument. And now, men, I'm sure, can argue as well as anything else. But actually, when you begin to enter the text, one of the things that really suggests to me that this is a married couple is the fact they're having a real ding-dong row on the way back to Emmaus. And Jesus comes in and says, "What are you arguing about?" My final piece of evidence for you that suggests, at least in my mind, that one of the two is a woman, is that the Greek name Cleopas, if you put that into Hebrew, you would get Clopas. And we know of a Clopas because Clopas is mentioned at the crucifixion, because Mary, wife of Clopas, was there at the crucifixion. So it doesn't take a massive leap to go from saying there was a Mary who was a wife of a Clopas and a Clopas who's on the way to Emmaus, who are going to the same house, having an argument as they go. I am pretty convinced that the other disciple is Mary, wife of Clopas. In which case, we then do have an example of a woman who's called a disciple in the Gospels. And that, therefore, I think is interesting, as I'm sure you would imagine. Let me move on now to women in the Pauline communities, and I'll try and do this relatively quickly. But one of the things that happens when we think about women in the Pauline communities is that what people do is they will cite to you the key texts, and it normally goes like this. 1 Timothy 2, which talks about women not being allowed to teach a man, is the kind of the starting text. And then from that, you read 1 Corinthians 14, which talks about women not being allowed to speak in church. And then from that, you read 1 Corinthians 11, which talks about women prophesying with a sign of exousia, authority on their head. And therefore, from that, we know that there were no women in leadership in the earliest Pauline communities. And what I want to do is say, what if we don't start with 1 Timothy 2? What if we start in the other direction, and we actually have a look at the Pauline communities? And we say, what can we know about the presence of women in the earliest Pauline communities? And when we do that, this is what happens. So the first thing that it's worth you kind of factoring in to think about is that within Pauline scholarship, there is an agreement that there are two key kinds of leadership that took place in the Pauline communities. There were itinerant leaders and there were local leaders. So the itinerant leaders were the ones who, like Paul, Aquila and Priscilla, those kinds of people, would travel around proclaiming the gospel. They wouldn't stay in one place for very long, and they would move on. This was a very significant pattern in the early church, and it continued well on into the 2nd century, so that you find people like 1 Clement giving rules about how you engage with itinerant leadership. One of the things that entertains me about that is 1 Clement, who writes that the epistle to 1 Clement in the 2nd century says, if you have an itinerant leader come to the house, then you will know that they're a genuine itinerant leader if they don't stay for more than 3 days. If they stay for more than 3 days, then they're sponges and don't trust them. It's quite I paraphrase, you understand. But one of the things I think is quite important then to recognise is that itinerant leadership is a really important strand in the early church. And then there were local leaders. And the local leaders were the ones who stayed in one place. They had people who gathered in their houses, and they were probably the leaders of the community that gathered in their house. When you know that, it's then quite interesting to have a look at women mentioned in various of both the Pauline epistles and in Acts. And we discover things like this. The epistle to the Colossians addresses Nympha, and the mention is made that the church is meeting in her house. Now, if your general assumption is that a local leader was somebody who had a church meeting in their house, it is not a leap to say, well, if there is a woman who has a church meeting in her house, she probably was the leader of the local community. It would be unusual for that not to be the case. I'll skip over Chloe because we just don't really know enough about her. We've got Eunice and Lois, who proclaimed the gospel to Timothy, mentioned in 2 Timothy. We have Lydia, about whom I think many thoughts. But Lydia, I think, is really, really interesting. So Lydia, as you will know, is a prominent businesswoman in Philippi. She was a dealer in purple. And most significantly of all, Acts tells us that she was the very first ever Western Christian. So when Paul is traveling in his missionary journeys, he has a vision of a man from Macedonia who says, come over and help us. And so he travels from Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, over into Greece. The very first place he goes is Philippi. The very first person he meets is Lydia. The very first person baptized, having heard Paul, is Lydia, and therefore she is the first convert of Paul's Christian mission. Now, if the author of Acts had a problem with women being significant in the tradition, he'd have put in another story before Paul got to Philippi. I think there is a real significance in the fact that Lydia is the first Western Christian recorded in Acts. We've also got Euodia and Syntyche. Euodia and Syntyche, you possibly know, are mentioned in Philippians, and here's the great conundrum of the great conundrum, fascinates me for hours, is Lydia, first Christian convert in Philippi. When Paul writes the letter to the Philippians, Lydia's not there. Where's she gone? Is one of the really interesting questions. And if you've read my book, Lydia, you know I have many thoughts about this. But the people who are there are Euodia and Syntyche. And Paul calls them co-workers. The word that's used in Greek is those who fight shoulder to shoulder. If you think about kind of Roman battle, you stand with your shields next to each other and you're shoulder to shoulder. Paul calls them co-fighters shoulder to shoulder with him in the gospel. Now, if we take the 1 Timothy 2 affects 1 Corinthians 14 affects 1 Corinthians 11 line, then how are they fighting shoulder to shoulder with him if they're not saying anything? It doesn't make much sense. Actually, it is much more sensible that they were proclaiming the gospel like everyone else. Then, quickly, the women mentioned in Romans 16. We have a mention of another Mary, as if we don't have enough Marys already. Mary, who worked hard among you. We have Tryphena and Tryphosa, who are workers in the Lord. We have the mother of Rufus, who is fascinating. I have various theories about her, but we'll just mention her for now. We have Julia, not to be mistaken for Junia, who's coming up later, and Nereus' sister. We have Junia, about whom there has been more written in New Testament scholarship than possibly any other person in existence. Because the argument, if you know about Junia in Romans 16 verse 7, she is described by Paul as prominent among the apostles, another female apostle mentioned. But people would argue either that her name doesn't mean that she's a she, that various people would argue that the name is actually Junias, or that it doesn't mean she's prominent among the apostles. It means that she is, so the argument is that she's well known to the apostles rather than prominent among the apostles. You have to do a little bit of grammatical switchery in order to be able to get there. And I won't go on. You will probably know that I would not agree with it. And then we've got Prisca and Aquila. We know that Prisca is an itinerant leader. She travels from place to place. And most strikingly of all, her name is mentioned first when Paul regularly mentions the two together, which suggests that she's the person who comes to mind. And then finally, we have Phoebe, who we know brought the letter of the Romans from Corinth to Rome, and Paul then commends her to the Roman Christians, says that she's a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. One of the things that those of us who are interested in ministry in the New Testament would love, if Paul could just have added a little phrase after deacon in the church of Cenchreae, because what she did all day was. We would have a much better understanding of deacons in the first century. And I'm sure you would also have liked to have known what she did in Corinth. But what I think is interesting is that he could say that she's a deacon of the church in Cenchreae, and the Romans all went, oh, she's a deacon of the church in Cenchreae, excellent. As though it was so widely known that they understood exactly what she did. And I still go, you couldn't have told us what it meant to the Romans, but he couldn't, and he didn't. So there we go. But the reason why I tell you about all of those women in the Pauline communities is that we have evidence there of women who led local churches, of women who were itinerant leaders, of women who were highly influential in all sorts of other ways. Paul describes them as co-workers, people who fight alongside him for the gospel. That suggests that actually in the Pauline communities, there were a large number of women in leadership. So therefore, I would argue that what we ought to do is say, well, that's really interesting. There were loads of women in leadership in the earliest Pauline communities. Could we be reading those other texts incorrectly if they're suggesting that they shouldn't do it, if he's absolutely fine with all of these women in leadership that he mentions long lists of without batting any eyelids whatsoever? And then when you do that, then you read that back, then you go backwards and read back in the opposite direction and recognize that women in 1 Corinthians 11 were allowed to prophesy. So therefore, if Paul says that women aren't allowed to speak in 1 Corinthians 14, perhaps actually it doesn't mean what we thought it meant, because I've never myself heard a woman prophesying without her speaking. So therefore, she was probably speaking while she was prophesying, and therefore 1 Corinthians 14 can't quite mean that. And if Prisca's allowed to correct Apollos because his doctrine's wrong, actually clearly 1 Timothy 2 must mean something else, assuming you think Paul wrote it. But that's one of those things where you have then to read back against. So, where do we end up then when we're thinking about women in the Bible? We recognize, I hope, that there were lots of women around. And Christian art, our imaginations, the way in which we engage with the Bible does not help us in imagining all of those women in the text. I would encourage you to, in your imaginations, put them all back in. And if you're in any doubt, they're probably called Mary, so you're all right. But just recognizing that women are hugely influential in the biblical narratives. They are there, we just don't notice them most of the time. So the first thing that we could do on a really simple level is simply notice them. Note where they're there. In our imaginations, put them back in. Recognize that actually when people tell you women couldn't, ... they might not be right. It might actually be that 95% of women couldn't, but actually 5% of women could and did. And therefore, if you find evidence of them doing it, how about you imagine that they did it rather than assume they couldn't do it because someone's told you they couldn't? And one of those things I think is actually really quite significant. We are at time, but I'd quite like to read a story to end. Will you allow me to read a story to end? Because one of the things that I'm trying to do in my Women of Holy Week book is to do that imagining back in. And one of the things I think that happens when you start with your list of all the Marys and Salome and Joanna and Susanna is to begin to recognize that around Jesus were this remarkable cloud of faithful, glorious women. And if we can go and talk about the women who genuinely were there, then the story begins to change. It all looks different. So let me read, by way of ending, my story, which is about the crucifixion, from Women of Holy Week. And then we've got time, I hope, for some questions. My name is Salome. I know what you're thinking. Not that Salome. I grew up in Nazareth with Mary. We were inseparable until the angel came. Not that I knew at the time that an angel had come. One day, we were young women facing the future together. The next, Mary just stopped talking to me. Then the gossip started. She was pregnant, and it wasn't Joseph's. No one knew why Joseph stood by her. She'd brought shame right into his house, but still he protected her. It made no sense to anyone. They were the talk of the village. Then they went away for the census, and I didn't see her for years. One day, years later, she and Joseph returned with their little boy, Jesus. They'd been in Egypt, apparently. Years went by, the gossip subsided, and we became close again. I remember so clearly when Jesus started to travel and to teach. Mary was mortified. After being in the spotlight all those years, she'd imagined a quiet old age, her family around her. It took her a while, but eventually she understood, and she'd reminisce about the strange events that happened at his birth. She'd always known, she said, that he wouldn't be just anyone. She just hadn't wanted to accept it. At first, I kept up with what he was doing for Mary's sake. But before long, I followed him for my sake. His teaching made sense of the world. It made sense of me. So I was there on that awful day. We were there. People often forget it, but we were there. Later, they said that all his followers had run away, that he'd been left quite alone, that everyone had left him. Everyone, I would ask. Yes, we all left him, Peter would say. We're all as bad as each other. We all left him. We all fled. All of us? Yes, all of us. Every last... Oh. It often took him a while, but most of the time he would get there in the end. At least until he forgot again. Not everyone. Exactly, I would say. Not everyone. You see, we were there, Mary Magdalene and me. Obviously not in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus had gone ahead with the 12 by himself, leaving us bemused and grieving. But the moment we heard what had happened, and it went round Jerusalem like wildfire, we followed him, just like we had in happier times in Galilee. It's what I've always done. When disaster strikes and I don't know what to do, I do what I normally do, day in, day out, until the moment comes when I do know what to do again. So when we heard, when it felt as though the world was collapsing around us, we did what we had been doing for years. We followed him. We followed him to Caiaphas' house and shivered through the long, dark hours in the courtyard. We followed him to Pilate's house, listening with incredulous horror while the crowd cried out, "Crucify, crucify," all around us. We followed him to Herod's house and back again. And then we followed him where we never imagined we'd go, to his crucifixion. At some point during the long, miserable wait, Mary Magdalene slipped away and came back with the other women, Susanna and Joanna, Mary, Clopas' wife, and Mary, Joseph's mother, and of course Jesus' own mother. It was pitch black by then, so we inched closer and closer, and we stood there. We stood there all that cold, wretched day, watching as breath by dying breath, our hopes and dreams died before our eyes, and with them, everything we held dear. We talked over the years, Mary and I, about the strange events that had happened when he was born. In the end, she did tell me about the angel coming. She even told me his name, Gabriel. We pondered together about it all, wondering what it meant. The thing we talked about most was what Simeon had said to her when she'd taken Jesus to the temple as a baby. He said the strangest things about who Jesus would become, the outrage he would cause, and how he would reveal who people really were. He was right. I'd seen it in so many of the people Jesus met. I'd noticed it in him myself. There was something about him and how that made you react, which simply revealed who you really were, even if you weren't aware of it in the first place. But it was the last thing that Simeon had said that Mary puzzled over the most. Apparently, Simeon had turned to her at the end, looked at her with deep compassion and said that a sword would pierce her soul too. She'd wondered over the years what he'd meant. Perhaps he'd meant that awful moment when she thought Jesus was lost in Jerusalem. Perhaps he'd meant the pain of him leaving home, the desperate loss of her beloved firstborn son. Perhaps he'd meant the embarrassment she felt when she'd first heard that he'd started teaching people without ever having studied to be a rabbi. Was that what he'd meant? We wondered together over many, many hours. As I stood there that day and looked at Mary, I imagined that all those things we talked about felt like nothing more than pinpricks right now. As we were holding on to each other in our grief, in the simple effort to stay upright, I discovered that she'd been thinking exactly the same thing as me. I heard her whisper quietly to herself. So that's what Simeon meant. At some point, during that long, lonely vigil, the beloved disciple appeared quietly by our side. I don't know when he got there. That was just like him, never with a fanfare, never drawing attention to himself, never forcing himself into situations. I think that was what Jesus liked so much about him. His company was gentle, undemanding, easy. When so many people wanted so much from Jesus all of the time, he didn't. He was just there. He was one of those people you felt better simply because they were there. From the cross, Jesus noticed him at almost the same time as we did. He hadn't spoken during that long, agonizing time. But just then he said, "Your son," and "your mother," looking at one and then the other of them. Then he just looked at Mary, a look of pure love. It broke my heart, and he wasn't even my son. A few moments later, he asked for a drink and sighed, "It is finished." Then it was. Everything was over, everything bar our anguish. We stood there for what felt like hours, numb and shocked. Then we did what we'd always done. We followed him. Some men we didn't know took his body off the cross, so we followed them. They took him to a tomb nearby, so we followed them. We watched as they buried him. They didn't anoint him or use spices. They were in too much of a rush before sundown. They put his body on the ledge, rolled the stone across the entrance, and went away. We stood at a distance, unsure what to do next. We couldn't do anything the next day. It was the Sabbath, but we agreed we'd come back early on Sunday morning before anyone else was up. We'd anoint him then. You may be thinking that we hadn't thought it through, and you'd be right. Grief does that to you. We had no idea how we'd roll the stone away. The whole task, not just the rolling of the stone, but the anointing and the ceremony, all of that was a man's job. Normally our job was to lead the lamentation. But we had no choice. they'd run away, all of them. And there was only us. And after everything we'd been through, after everything he'd been through, and after everything we'd been through, we couldn't bear the thought that his body would be left there uncared for, unwept over, unanointed. We were doing what we'd always done, following him, caring for him as best we could, even when no one noticed. They said later that everyone ran away. We were there. People often forget it, but we were there.
Away from the light. I think we have a little bit of time for perhaps 3 or 4 questions. So if you have something burning, we have 1 or 2 runners with microphones.
So the first hand went up, it's right down at the back there.
Yes. So
To give you your exercise for the evening.
Finally, for Manchester, I really like to thank you and appreciate the fact that I will continue to go back to tell those men who were behind locked doors that it was us women who Jesus sent to tell them that he had risen. Thank you.
I mean, when you were talking about women disciples in the Gospels, you talked about Mary, but there's also Martha. I mean, one of the things that always, as a deacon, one of the things that always really annoys me is that, particularly in a lot of our children's Bibles, it always talks about Martha doing housework when she's talked about as doing diaconia.
Yep.
And no one assumes that for the men in Act 6. And I mean, so it's particularly in children's Bibles, and I was just wondering if you knew of any good children's resources which have more positive models for women than many of ours do.
It's a great, it bugs me enormously as well. Martha was busy with many tasks. Often it's translated about, no, she was doing a lot of ministry. That's what was going on. And no, I don't know of a translation that actually renders that properly. So you'll just have to do it yourself when you're reading out there. But shall we just add, because we did talk about Martha, but should we also just add that if the Mary and Martha of Luke and the Mary and Martha of John are the same too, if there's a conversation to be had among those, but let's say they are for the sake of argument. Well, either they aren't, and there's 2 Marys and 2 Marthas, which is interesting, or they are. Martha is the one who says to Jesus around Lazarus's resurrection, I believe you are the Messiah. Which is the same as Peter says, I believe you are the Christ. And much less credit is given to her saying, there are only 2 people who say that they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. One of them is Peter, the other one is Martha. So let's raise the banner for Martha.
there was a lady with dark hair right on the side here. Yeah, by you, Liz.
Thank you. I was just going to ask about Mary and Martha and what your thoughts were on Elizabeth Schrader's work suggesting that perhaps Lazarus' sister Mary is actually Mary Magdalene and that Martha has been written in as a conflation with Luke 10.
I have so many thoughts. I'm not allowed to have them, so many of them this time in the evening. I thought it's a really interesting theory, which I don't believe. Is the headlines of it. Very briefly, she refers to a text P66, which is indeed one of the oldest of the textual manuscripts. But in order for it to be kind of an arguable fact, what you'd have to do is demonstrate that P66 is the parent document of all the other New Testament, and there isn't that evidence. It's one of the cascade, but there are others where Martha is very clearly in the text. The other issue is that if you have a close look at the text, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to be saying Mary and Mary, Mary and Mary all the way through. So actually, it's a nice idea, but I don't think it really works. The other thing that I would say is that I don't quite understand. I think Mary Magdalene is fabulous, exactly as she is, being the apostle to the apostles. I'm not quite sure why you need to put that kind of claim onto her as well. My view is there are loads of Marys and loads of Marthas in this period. Why not have lots of women who are saying really influential things to Jesus and not all squish them down into a single person? And also, I think Mary came from Magdala. And I have just very recently stood in Migdal and seen the first century synagogue that they've excavated. And I think it's much more likely that she was Mary from Magdala. But what is fascinating, the one thing I take away from all of the argument is that the Mary and Martha who are mentioned in Luke are in Galilee. The Mary and Martha who are mentioned in John are in Bethany. So actually, what if there are two Marys and two Marthas? Well, more than two Marys, but definitely two Marthas.
Permit me first to thank the Methodist women in Britain, the leadership, for these lectures and for entitling them Mary Bosanquet. We've driven all the way from Essex to come this evening, and we're going back. Simply because I served as a minister in Leytonstone Methodist Church for 12 years, and Mary Bosanquet was always an inspiration. But thank you, Dr. Gooder, for such an illuminating lecture. I'd just like to ask the question, why is it that after 21 centuries, well, 20 centuries, 21 centuries of biblical and theological study, that women are still cancelled out? And even in the church, equity is a real problem. Thank you.
There's a long answer. I will not bore you with the long answer, but the short answer, I think, is because whenever we engage with biblical text, you know, I said that the greatest crime of a New Testament scholar was eisegesis. Actually, we all do it all of the time because we can't quite help ourselves. We bring our lens, our culture, our experience, and we read the text through that. And for years and years and years, that lens has been so male-dominated that it hasn't, and I would argue that, and I have a theory about how it happened in the 2nd century, but I think there is something that happened significantly in the 2nd century that then drove the earliest Christians into adopting that lens more fully and then continuing on with the lens. And I think you are absolutely right. The church is not a place of equality for women and for many other people as well, but for women in the 21st century. Part of what I'm trying to do in doing this work is to say, what if actually we become the generation in which we start reading differently, in which we bring a different lens? And we can do that.
One over this side, please.
Thank you very much indeed for such an inspirational talk to us. Well worth waiting for. I was here this time last year for it, so I'm glad to hear it. Now then, have you anything to say in particular about Peter's mother-in-law?
Oh, yes.
Because, you know, there you have, she was lifted up, raised, etc. So,
yes. Please. I have many things to say about Peter's mother-in-law. One of the things is that, again, we just wipe her out, don't we? There she was raised from the dead. We imagine her pootling around in Capernaum, making things, and not actually kind of following Jesus. So one of the questions is, what was Peter's mother-in-law called? Is she one of those women that is named in the Gospels? Oh, take a wild stab in the dark. Mary. But actually that kind of recognition, I mean, it's such an important point you make, is that we assume that so somebody once said to me a few weeks ago, you know, have we got any evidence that any of the disciples had relatives? Yeah, we do. But we forget about them because we assume that she just stayed in Capernaum making the tea and not really doing very much. And again, I think your point is a really important one, which is that not only does Peter have a mother-in-law, if he's got a mother-in-law, he's got a wife. So therefore, what about Peter's wife, and what can we know about Peter's wife? And the answer is not very much. But once you are, that's, in a way, you're doing exactly what I'm hoping you will do, is to say, yeah, but what about that woman? What happened to her? What do we imagine is happening to her? And then all of a sudden, now in your mental imagination, Peter's mother-in-law will be in the background. And I think that's really good and interesting.
Perhaps one more question.
Hi. One of the most fascinating stories I find is the Samaritan woman at the well. Yes. I am irritated with John with the fact that we don't know her name when she occupies so many verses in his gospel.
She gets this big chunk of text and you couldn't have called her. Let's call her Mary.
I remember hearing John Bell a few years ago suggest that she was a survivor of sexual abuse, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Absolutely. I agree largely, because one of the key things to know about women in the first century, but particularly women from Jewish and Samaritan backgrounds, is women couldn't divorce. They were the passive recipient of divorce. So she wasn't somebody, when it says she was divorced, it means it literally, as in she didn't do the divorcing, she was divorced by someone else, because women weren't allowed to do that in the first century. And women were only allowed to be married 5 times. So therefore, if you take that into consideration, then the Samaritan woman, was somebody who had been divorced by 5 men who cast her off, and then she became the pariah because, and when we know she was a pariah because she was going to collect water at midday when no one in their right mind would collect water on her own. So she was cast out from society. So not only was she somebody who had suffered greatly at the hand of 5 men who decided to divorce her, and bear in mind in the first century, the rabbis are having a conversation about on what grounds you can divorce your wife. And there are some rabbis who say only on the grounds of adultery. Think about Jesus, because you'll see how that kind of fits into his teaching. But there are other rabbis who say you can divorce your wife for burning the dinner. Therefore, one of the things we don't know are the grounds upon which she was divorced, but I think you could, without much of a leap, go to the John Bell theory of saying this is somebody who has been so badly abused by 5 different men, and then by society isn't allowed to be married. And it completely changes the story from the way in which it's normally interpreted to somebody who is absolutely vulnerable and miserable and meets Jesus along the way, incidentally, at a moment when he's vulnerable and miserable. And then you get these kind of really interesting conversations. So thank you. Great question.
I think we need to draw the questioning to a close. So I know many of you will have lots of thoughts and questions. We've certainly got plenty to take away and think about, haven't we? Barbara, I know, would like to have a brief word, and then Ruth is going to have a few short words as well. Just to remind you that this has been recorded, and the intention is that this lecture will be on the Methodist Women in Britain's YouTube site in September. So if you want to re-listen or share some of that with your groups, then that facility will be available in the autumn. Okay, so Barbara. Oops. Sorry, that's just my glasses.
I've got this one. Yes. Does it work if I just hold it? Yes, I'm only speaking for about 30 seconds. Oh, 30. Oh, it's working. Thank you. This evening's event has been brought to you by Methodist Women in Britain, whoop whoop, Methodist women are providing many lively and interesting events and webinars, but I'd just particularly like to draw your attention to the European event, which is in June next year. And next June, the area president for Europe brackets Continental is organising the European seminar where any Methodist woman, and we don't mind if you bring a bloke, any Methodist woman is welcome to come to Porto, what is in Portugal, where we are having the European seminar. And because she is the rep for her conference, we actually have the area president for Europe brackets Continental here. So I'd just like you to clock Lila while she is here. But to keep your eyes on Lila, obviously, but also to keep your eyes on our website for more news of that. And I'm flagging it particularly because you might want to get yourself a porcelain pig and start putting your little coins in it. We think it will be a great event. You're on.
Well, Paula, you made it, and we're delighted that you did. Thank you so much. It's been a delightful evening.
Let me just turn that off for you.
Okay.
There you go.
It's been a delightful evening and an insight, hasn't it, into life in New Testament times, and particularly into the life of women. And I think it's our job now to go away and raise the profile, along with Paula, in our Bible studies and in our worship. So thank you, Paula, for all you've done. And we would like you to accept this gift.
Thank you. That's so kind.